What we need to do now is finish World War II and then begin our discussion of the Cold War. And my plan is to finish that lecture. Let me get you arranged right. So I'm sorry that I'm missing this, but I really have to be at this funeral, so that's why I'm doing this, and hopefully you guys will find this helpful. Make sure my sound is up. Okay, so I think where we left off is that we were talking about World War II, and we were looking at the two fronts of the war, and I was explaining that there was fighting going on in Asia against Japan, and I think for all of my classes I got through that. And then what we need to talk about now is the fighting in Europe, which it was to take Europe back from Germany and to some extent Italy as well. I guess we sort of tend to see Germany as the larger foe. So in any case, what we talked about was how if you look at your PowerPoint, where the PowerPoint that says two fronts, where we are now is the one with the blue background that says War in Europe. So the point at which the Americans and Allied forces went into Europe to try and take Europe back from Germany was on D-Day, what we call D-Day, and that was June 6th, 1944. And this was an absolutely massive invasion of France, and it occurred near the English Channel, sort of that small space between England and France. And I'll show it to you on a map when we get back into class. The Americans had this enormous plan, and it was organized by Eisenhower. And Eisenhower would go on to become president, in part because he was so popular after this successful invasion. They made this invasion at the beaches of Normandy, which you guys probably have seen pictures or seen movies about, and they set up a decoy where there was to be another invasion in a place that was a lot easier to invade. They deliberately chose an area that was very difficult, and Hitler didn't really think that they would make the invasion there. So they had this decoy set up a little bit further away, and then they made their invasion at Normandy. And you guys are seeing a video this week with a lot of different men remembering that invasion. It was absolutely massive, and that's really what made it so successful, because otherwise it doesn't look like it'd be possible. The men are coming in on their ships, they're getting off in the water, they're sort of chest high in the water with sometimes 100 pounds of gear on their backs. They have to wade through the water. They get up onto the beaches, and then once they're up on the beaches, there are these very steep cliffs in front of them, and they have to make it up these cliffs. And the Germans are at the top of the cliffs shooting down at them with machine guns. So it's really quite amazing that it worked. And part of the reason that it did work is the men just kept coming and coming and coming and coming and coming. And they were able to push the Germans back. As I said, D-Day occurred in June of 45, and by, I believe it was August, let me see, June 6th, 44. I misspoke, I'm sorry. D-Day invasion was June 6th of 44, and less than a year later, Europe had fallen. It was about a month or so after the D-Day invasion that the Allied forces took back Paris, which was a very big deal, and something that the French remained very grateful for, not just liberating Paris, which is their crown jewel, but the entire country. Okay, so you'll get some first-hand accounts of that D-Day invasion. And yes, here we have the date on the PowerPoint. Victory in Europe was declared on May 8th of 1945, so just a year after that. Now, if you look at the next PowerPoint, you'll see a slide that says International Politics, Yalta Conference. February of 45. So this is a meeting that was very important, very famous. You may have seen the picture before of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. And as I just said, if the war in Europe ended in May of 45, this meeting occurred a couple months before then, because this was February of 45. And what's interesting about this meeting is how these three leaders sort of see that the war is going to be over soon, and they're talking about how they're going to deal with Europe, and particularly Germany. And what we see, as the slide says, plan to divide Germany, that was where they made that decision that Germany would be divided in half, and you had Eastern Germany and West Germany. And the East Germany would be pretty much, as we're going to see later, under the control of the Soviets, and Western Germany remains more in the community of the West of Europe, friendly to the United States. Now there's a middle line on that PowerPoint that says U.S. policy shift to containment. This is a little bit confusing because they weren't talking about containment at this meeting. They were talking really at this meeting about how the Russians would have their sphere of influence on their side of the world, and the Americans with the Europeans would have their sphere of influence on the western side of the world. And that seemed to be okay to the Americans at this point, because we haven't yet seen what the Russians are going to do after World War II. So that U.S. policy shift to containment, what that really is referring to is how we're going to shift to containment after the war. What we're going to see after the war is how the Russians very brutally install totalitarian communist governments in places like Poland and Bulgaria. And this is going to be very distressing to America. And we're going to shift to this idea that we have to contain the Soviet Union. And so what I want you to understand is that at Yalta, we thought, oh, it'll be fine if the Russians kind of have their neighborhood and we have our neighborhood, and we'll let everybody manage it however they want. It's going to be after the war, when we see what the Russians do, that we shift to saying we need to contain the spread of communism. So I wanted to clarify that a little bit. I don't really want you to be confused by that slide. All right, now the previous slide says the home front, and I want you guys to know about sort of three areas of World War II that have to do with the home front. One says Rosie the Riveter. Now what I want you to know is that women were moved into the work setting, into factories. They were building planes, they were welding tanks, kind of a lot of factory kind of jobs that you would assume women wouldn't have. But they were needed so badly that there was actually a significant propaganda kind of campaign to get women into the workforce. And it's kind of funny, some of the ads said things like, you need to put your children in daycare, that is where they'll be socialized the best, and really, what kind of mother are you if you don't do that? It's funny, after the war, when they want the women to leave those jobs, they're going to give women a different message and say, oh, what are you doing with your children in daycare? No good mother puts her child in daycare if she can help it. You really should get them home, be home with your children, and let the men have their jobs back. So women get kind of shifting messages depending on what the society wants from them. But during the war, society wanted them in the factories working, helping support the war effort. And women largely liked those opportunities. They liked the independence. They liked getting a paycheck. And many of them are going to be frustrated and upset when they're asked to leave the workforce after the war. Now, the second thing on that slide on the home front says African American soldiers. And kind of like the wars I've talked about before, many African American men very much wanted to fight. They wanted to defend their country. They wanted to demonstrate their patriotism, and they did fight. At the beginning of the war, the armed forces were segregated. So you had, black companies and white. But by the end of the war, they had been integrated. And one of the things that I think is kind of interesting is how there really is a tie between black men in the war and the civil rights movement. And you see some interesting connections. One of the connections is going to be that many people are horrified by the way black veterans will be treated when they come home, particularly to the South, after having fought for this country. And that will actually motivate some people to get involved and support the civil rights movement, which we're going to be talking about very soon. I like to tell students about one Atlantan in particular, whose name you've probably heard, Hosea Williams. And my students will frequently say, yeah, Hosea Williams, he's got Feed the Hungry, there's a charity for him. And that's true. He actually has a very interesting story tied to World War II. He had, and really tied to some of the other things we've talked about in class, he was born in Georgia. I need to look it up exactly, but I think it would have been the 30s or so. And yeah, that sounds about right. He had very poor parents. Actually, interestingly enough, my understanding is that his mom and dad were both blind, and they met in an institute for blind and poor young people. And somehow his mom and dad found each other, and he was born. And then his mother had to leave this institution because she was young and pregnant and unmarried. And so she moved back with her parents. I believe it was her parents. In any case, he was raised by his grandparents for quite a while. And then when he was about 14 or 15, and this, by the way, was kind of in the area of Macon, Georgia, he had to run away because a white mob was threatening to lynch him because they said that he was having a relationship with a white girl. So he ran away and eventually joined the army and was sent to Europe in World War II. So he fought very bravely in World War II, and then he even earned the Purple Heart because he was injured over there. Well, when he came back, like so many black men who returned to the South after fighting, he was treated very badly. In fact, I believe it was in Plains, Georgia, so Jimmy Carter's home. He was at a bus station, and he was all dressed up in his uniform, and he asked the white woman at the ticket booth for some water. But she said no because it was in the white section of the bus station. And he really was thirsty, so he reached over and got himself some water anyway. Well, what ended up happening was a white crowd of men saw him do this and were infuriated. So they beat him up and they left him for dead. In fact, everybody around thought that he was dead, and they even called the undertaker to come and get his body. But that man realized that he wasn't dead and had him nursed back to health. And I think after about 6 weeks, he was able to be discharged. In any case, he was so bitter and hurt by that experience that he said that he wished that Hitler had won the war. And later, I think because of that experience, and then because of what was happening to his children, when he was in Savannah, Georgia in particular, he really disliked the fact that they were going to lunch counters and they weren't able to be served. He really got involved in the civil rights movement and became really one of the right-hand men of Martin Luther King. So if you look at sort of old pictures of King, you can see Hosea Williams in a lot of these pictures. All right, so the last area that I wanted to talk about with the home front had to do with Japanese Americans. And I think many of you probably know that there was a huge amount of anxiety, particularly on the West Coast, about people of Japanese descent. And just a significant fear that they were really spies, that they couldn't be trusted, that they weren't patriotic Americans. And so Japanese Americans were herded up and forced to leave their homes and their businesses and to live in internment camps for the remainder of the war. These were often things like park or state park or fairgrounds, those kinds of civic structures, but they were forced to live in these barracks and these camping ground settings for the duration of the war. And this was just a terrible injustice because these people weren't guilty of anything. They hadn't done anything wrong. There was just a lot of anxiety that they would do something wrong or they were going to be spies. Many of them lost all their money, businesses, homes. Some of them died. And I've had students ask, was this a concentration camp? I'm not really comfortable with calling it a concentration camp exactly because it wasn't the intent to kill them. But it was a really horrific experience and something that I think as Americans we are still ashamed that it happened. And sometimes people will make comparisons between what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II to what's happened to Middle Eastern Americans after 9/11. All right, so that kind of concludes, I think, what I need you guys to know about World War II. And you might make yourself a bit of a timeline because we looked at the fight in the war in the Pacific, and then we looked at the war in Europe, and then I explained about the Yalta Conference that was in February of 45. So in order to keep those dates straight, you might want to kind of make yourself a timeline so you can have a sense of what happened when. And if I had a chalkboard behind me, I would do that for you. And if you need me to do that in class, I can. By the end of World War II, I'll just wrap it up with some numbers. There were 300,000 American lives lost, 20 million Russian soldiers died, and 6 million Jews and others died in the Holocaust. So it was very terrible and big numbers there. All right, well, what I want to switch to now is the Cold War and the Truman years, and this next lecture goes from 1945 to 1953. Keep in mind, I haven't mentioned it to you yet, but Roosevelt died in April of 45. So, and remember that the atomic bombs were dropped in August of 45. So you do the math, or you may already know, it was actually Roosevelt's vice president, Truman, who became the president in April of 45. And then it was, of course, he who made the executive decision to drop the atomic bombs. Well, Truman then was the president after the war ended, and that's kind of what we need to talk about now. And this lecture is entitled The Cold War and Truman Years because the United States really moved into what we call the Cold War after World War II, where the United States felt tension and concern about the Soviet Union and the spread of communism after the war. So what I'm going off now primarily, let's see if this will show, is the outline that I have on history class. And the first point that it makes is the shift to containment. And as I said before, at the Yalta Conference back in, was that February of 45, like I said, the United States was saying it's okay if the Soviet Union has their sphere of influence and we have our sphere of influence over here. But that's going to change when the war ends. And we're not as comfortable with letting them just have their free sphere of influence, do what they want, because we watched how brutally the communists installed governments in Poland and Bulgaria, and also the way they occupied Eastern Germany. And that caused the United States to reevaluate its policy and a shift to this idea of containment, that we contain the spread of the Soviet Union, or this influence of the Soviet Union and communism. So I usually ask students, if you were an advisor to Truman after World War II is over, you're sitting at a big table with a lot of other advisors, and they say, we need to contain the spread of communism. How do we do it? And I usually ask students to think, okay, how would we do containment? And oftentimes students will say things like, oh, maybe spread propaganda to promote Western ideas or democracy. And that's partly true. And then I sometimes have other students mention military alliances with countries that are near them, who are friendly to the United States. And that's another aspect that's true. But I'm going to explain sort of three areas, three ways to do containment, and the third has 5 parts to it. So the first way that we could do containment in the United States, practice containment, was, like I just hinted at, giving military and economic aid to politically unstable countries, particularly, and for example, Greece and Turkey after World War II. So what does that mean? It means you identify countries, particularly those that initially were near the Soviet Union, and you say, oh, the people are hungry and the government is weak. And that is a bad combination, because those places are vulnerable to the United States coming in. Sorry, I misspoke. Those places are vulnerable to the Soviet Union coming in and saying, let us help you. We'll feed your people, and your government is weak, so we'll take over your government. And those places we were particularly worried about falling to communism. And it was the term falling. That was the language that was used. There was fear of these countries falling to communism. So you go in there, you give them economic aid, you feed their people, you prop up their governments, and that makes them more resilient to a communist takeover. Now, of course, probably a lot of you know that unfortunately what ended up happening in many cases is the United States is going to prop up governments that are really terrible. They're corrupt, they have bad human rights violations, they're not democratic, they don't represent our values. But we are going to do that anyway throughout the Cold War, because we see it as at least they're not communist governments. At least we're keeping them from falling to the communists, which the United States determined was the lesser of these two. Well, the governments in place were the lesser of the two evils. Okay, so that is the first piece, military and economic aid to politically unstable countries. The second piece is something that you may have heard of before, and that was called the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was a massive infusion of money into war-torn, devastated Europe. In other words, we need Europe to be strong. They're our partners militarily and diplomatically and economically, so we need to pour money back into Europe so that they can help fight the spread of communism too. And in fact, the Marshall Plan included $13 billion into European nations between 1948 and 1952. So the Marshall Plan was huge. And then the third part, see my three, there we go. The third part of the containment plan had to do with defense. And that was a 5-pronged military, or not just military, but a 5-pronged defense program. So let me give you what those 5 parts were. The first part was the development of atomic weapons. And we had developed atomic weapons, as you remember, during World War II. We had dropped them on Japan. We were going to continue to do that. Number 2 is strengthening our conventional military power. So continuing to build our planes and our tanks and our ships and our guns and our bombs, everything that you would associate with conventional military. And number 3, we've sort of hinted at already, we're building up our military alliances. Who are our friends in the world? Where can we land our planes? There was very much a sense during the Cold War that there were the Soviet Union's countries or communist countries, and then there were ours, or ones that were friendly to us. And I grew up in this era, so I really remember that sense of there being a scoreboard. And with number 3, military alliances, it's very much about keeping the ones who are on our side on our side. And then the 4th, we've kind of already said, but it was part of the defense program too, economic and military aid to friendly nations. So who are our friends? And we feed the money into them, and we feed military aid to keep their military strong. And then the last one is maybe the most, I was going to say fun, not always fun, sometimes fun. They made a lot of movies about it. And can you think of what it is? I usually try and get students to think of it. Well, the 5th one was continuing our espionage networks like the CIA. So spying on the Soviet Union or spying on countries that were friendly to the Soviet Union. And of course they were spying on us as well. So those were the 5 parts of the military, or 5 parts of the defense, I should say, 5 parts of the defense program. Now, the first and greatest challenge to containment, the first place where we tried to do containment was, anybody want to guess? It was China. It was China. And China, up until the late 40s, until 49, China had been ruled by what we would call this nationalist government. And I'm going to be using the term nationalist to mean usually a government that is from within that country and friendly to the United States. And the nationalist government that had been ruling China was led by a man named Chiang Kai-shek. You may have heard of that name before. But there was a lot of unrest, a lot of hunger, a lot of desperation in China. And so there was a communist revolution in China to overthrow Chiang Kai-shek. And the communists were very brutal and very ruthless, but they also were promising to feed people. And this very massive and largely popular revolt of a communist philosophy was led by Mao Zedong. Mao is spelled M-A-O. So this is the first time the United States had seen something like this happen, particularly on such a big scale. And so what we did was we gave money to Chiang Kai-shek to hold down and stop the communist revolution from Mao. As it turns out, we did not give them enough money, and really I don't know how much money it would have taken because Mao was enormously popular and had a lot of people behind him. And so, you probably know this, Mao succeeded. He overthrew the nationalist government and he established Communist China, or the People's Republic of China, as we call it, in December of 49. All right, so and do you know where all the nationalists went? I usually ask my students. Well, the nationalists went to Taiwan. And to this day, Taiwan is much more Western, much more friendly to the United States, but sort of has a very tense relationship with Communist China. And for example, if one of our leaders or our president has meetings with people from Taiwan, the Communist China gets mad. So we still have to manage this kind of triangle. So, do you remember who the president was when all of this happened? 49? It's Truman, right? And do you remember what party Truman is? He's a Democrat, right? Because he had been Roosevelt's vice president. So this is important because the Democrats lost, and that's the language that was used, the Democrats lost China. And this is going to haunt the Democrats throughout the Cold War, and I would argue it's still haunting the Democrats in our war on terror, because this precedent was set that the Democrats lost China, they lost this first attempt at containment, and the logic that some people reached was the Democrats are going to be weak. The Democrats are going to be weak on communism. The Republicans will be strong. I'm not saying that's accurate, but that is the perception, and that's certainly what a lot of Republicans would be saying throughout the Cold War, and I would say even to this day with the war on terror. All right, then we'll kind of get back to the world stage and communism in a minute, but I want to talk about Truman at home for a couple minutes. Truman had a really hard time as president, and for a long time he was perceived as an unsuccessful or weaker president. I think he's starting to be reevaluated in a more positive light now, but he did have a hard time because he was presiding over the country when it was transitioning to a peacetime economy from the wartime economy. You had all of these soldiers coming back and needing jobs. Women were being asked, like I said, to leave the workforce. We were seeing the civil rights movement becoming more vocal and strong, and Truman himself was very sympathetic and upset about the way black men were being treated after they served our country and they would come back to the South. But he wasn't really able to do very much for them because, remember, Truman's going to face resistance from the other party, which, remember, is the Republicans, and from white Southern Democrats within his own party. So he really wasn't able to be very effective in helping African Americans with that problem. He did try to push through a number of social programs building on Roosevelt's New Deal, and Truman called it his Fair Deal plan, and they were measures in education, healthcare, and civil rights. But he really was not able to get most of those through, again, because of resistance from Democrats and resistance from within his own party, from white Southerners who would resist, in particular, things having to do with civil rights. And he was also presiding over the Red Scare. In other words, he was the president when America became very concerned. I don't really like the word hysterical, but it captures what I'm trying to describe, that there was this panic about the spread of communism and the fear that the communists were coming into America too. And there's a slide for you guys to see. I've got my other screen up, so I'm following along with you guys. But there's a slide. Here it is. There is a slide on your PowerPoint that shows McCarthy. And some of you may know who McCarthy was. He was, let me pull this up for myself. McCarthy, yeah, it's the last slide in my World War II slide. McCarthy was a Republican who was leading the charge against communism spreading in the United States. We even often use the term McCarthyism because that seems to capture what he was leading, which was this massive campaign to root out communists anywhere in the United States. So he had a list of people, particularly in Hollywood and some of them in government, who he said were communists or sympathetic to communists. And if you were accused by him, he would haul you in front of Congress and question you and really make your life quite miserable. I think today's students think, oh, it's kind of silly and it's funny, but it wasn't funny at the time. It was really frightening at the time. And very few people were able to stand up to McCarthy because if you stood up to him, people would think that you were a communist. And I have Rosenberg trial on the PowerPoint. You may have heard of this before, but there was a couple who lived in Kansas, and their name was Rosenberg, Mr. and Mrs. Rosenberg, Ethel, and I'm not positive about his first name. But this was a couple who was accused of sharing secrets about the atomic weapons that the United States had with the Soviet Union. And they were put on trial, they were found guilty, and they were both executed. Husband and wife, they had like 7 and 9-year-old boys at the time. So that tells you how concerned and worried a lot of Americans were that you could execute these husband and wife, mom and dad, because they were considered spies. And to this day, there's a lot of controversy about whether they really were spies or not. If they did have any communication with the Soviets, what was it? I think there's a little bit more evidence against him than against her. But it kind of is an example for you of how intense things were. All right. Now, kind of getting back to the international scene again. We talked about how Truman lost China, and then Truman had another attempt to do containment in Korea. And I thought about ways that I could pull up a map of Korea for you, but it wasn't feasible. So I'll show you a map of Korea in class. But in case you don't know, Korea is a peninsula that is just west of Japan. So if you find Japan in your mind or on a map and you just go across the sea just a little bit, you get to the Korean peninsula. And at the top of that peninsula is the border with China. Okay, so that's kind of what Korea looked like, and still does actually. And in 1950, what happened was that the communists who were in North Korea, I should tell you that Korea was and is divided right in the middle between North Korea and South Korea. And the North Koreans who were communist crossed that line and came into South Korea. And South Korea, we'll say, was nationalist. It was more friendly to the United States. And so here we go. Communism is spreading. It's crossing borders, and it's gone into a nation that's friendly with us. So the United States, with the United Nations, so not just alone, went into South Korea and pushed the North Koreans back over the line that divided them. Now, that happened in a pretty short amount of time, with really a couple months right at the end of 1950. Then the Americans had this question. While we're there, we've got the troops, we've got the tanks. Maybe what we should do is keep going and try and kick the communists out of North Korea too. So this was a question that was being asked, and the general who was in charge over there was a guy by the name of MacArthur. Some of you have probably heard of MacArthur. He was very hardcore, very intense, cold warrior, and he basically said to Truman, "You're just a pansy for even asking the question. Of course we should try and kick the communists out of North Korea. We're here, we can do it, no problem. Why are you even asking this question?" And by the way, MacArthur on other occasions badmouthed Truman to the point that one time Truman had to kind of fly over there and remind MacArthur that he was still his boss and that he shouldn't be saying bad things about the president. But in any case, no big surprise to you probably, they made the decision to go ahead and keep fighting while they were there and try and kick the communists out. Now, Truman had one concern about that. He said, what if the Soviets or the Chinese get involved? If we do that, they might be mad and they might get involved. And MacArthur said, no, they won't. Don't worry about it. Well, MacArthur was incorrect about the Chinese. He was correct about the Soviets. They didn't get involved, but the Chinese did. The Chinese sent in troops to help the North Koreans. And when they did that, the Americans started to lose, and they started to lose the ground that they had initially gained. In other words, the communist North Koreans with their Chinese assistance went south of that line again. And within a short amount of time, the Americans had lost the capital of South Korea. So this was really bad news. It was a kind of a gamble that didn't go the way the Americans thought it would. So in the end, it evolved into a stalemate with no clear winner until about 1952. And that was when there was another presidential election. And as you can imagine, the Republicans seized on uh, the stalemate, the sense that Truman couldn't end the war. The Democrats had lost China too. And so the Republicans put forth a war hero from World War II. And who was that? Do you know? It was Eisenhower. And Eisenhower, kind of a lot of people loved Eisenhower because of his orchestration of D-Day, and Eisenhower won. And as soon as he won the election, he flew over there and he negotiated an armistice, basically a peace or an agreement to stop fighting. And they basically put the communists back in North Korea, the nationalists who were friendly to the United States in South Korea, and kind of put things back to where they had been at the beginning of the war. But kind of interesting thing about Korea is that it's still not over. The war is technically kind of on hiatus or on peace even to this day. But there was an armistice instead of a real peace treaty. So if you go to Korea today, and you go to that line, you'll see men with big guns pointed at each other along that line. And it remains a place of a lot of tension, a lot of anxiety. And if you've been paying attention to the news, you know that North Korea is a country that we're still very worried about. And the people within North Korea are not allowed any outside media. They are really just fed what the North Korean government wants them to have, both in terms of real food and in terms of understanding of what's outside the world. And if you look at, you may have seen maps of the world that show where there's electricity, and there's very little electricity in North Korea, but there's a lot in South Korea. I've seen statistics that have talked about how the people of North Korea are on average 4 or 6 inches, I don't remember the exact number, but 4 or 6, we'll guess 4 or 6 inches shorter than people in South Korea, just because of the malnutrition over the years. So remains a really scary and controlled place to this day. All right, and so that was Korea, and that was really the beginning then of Eisenhower's presidency. And I think that kind of wraps up what you guys need to know. The next lecture is called Politics and Culture of Abundance, and it's really looking at the 1950s, starting with 1952 when Eisenhower was elected, and then he would be reelected in 56. So we'll be talking about the 50s next. So thank you guys for following along with the video, and I will see you guys next time in class. All right? Thanks. Bye-bye. Let's see, how do I stop this?